Part 1 of Two American Slavery Documents. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Two American Slavery Documents by Various. Part 1. Life of James Mars, a Slave Born and Sold in Connecticut, by James Mars. To whom it may concern. These will certify that the bearer, Deacon James Mars, has been known to me and to the citizens of this town for a long period of years as an honest, upright, truthful man, a good citizen, an officer in his church, and a man whose life and character have gained the approbation, the esteem, and the good wishes of all who know him. Born a slave, the good providence of God has long since made him free, and, I trust, also taught him that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Jonathan Todd, Pittsfield, Massachusetts, June 23, 1868. Introduction. When I made up my mind to write this story, it was not to publish it, but it was at the request of my sister that lived in Africa, and has lived there more than 30 years. She had heard our parents tell about our being slaves, but she was not born until a number of years after they were free. When the war in which we have been engaged began, the thought came to her mind that her parents and brothers and sisters were once slaves, and she wrote to me from Africa for the story. I came to Norfolk on a visit at the time the war broke out, and some in Norfolk remember that I was once a slave. They asked me about it. I told them something about it. They seemed to take an interest in it, and as I was in Norfolk now, and having an opportunity to write it, I thought I would write it all through. In telling it to those, there were a great many things that I did not mention that I have written. After I had written it out, I saw that my brother and my other sister would think that I might give them the same, and my children had often asked me to write it. When I had got it written, as it made more writing than I was willing to undertake, to give each of them one, I thought I would have it printed, and perhaps I might sell enough to pay the expenses, as many of the people now on the stage of life do not know that slavery ever lived in Connecticut. End of letter and introduction. A Slave Born and Sold in Connecticut. The treatment of slaves was different at the North from the South. At the North they were admitted to be a species of the human family. I was told when a slave boy that some of the people said that slaves had no souls, and that they would never go to heaven, let them do ever so well. My father was born in the state of New York, I think in Columbia County. He had, I think, 3 different masters in that state, one by the name of Van Epps, and he was General Van Rensselaer's slave in the time of the Revolution, and was a soldier in that war. He was then owned by a man whose name was Rutzer, and then was owned in Connecticut, in Salisbury, and then by the minister in North Canaan. My mother was born in Old Virginia, in Loudoun County. I do not remember the name of the town. The minister of North Canaan, whose name was Thompson, went to Virginia for a wife, or she came to him. In some way they got together so that they became man and wife. He removed her to Canaan, and she brought her slaves with her, and my mother was one of them. I think there were 2 of my mother's brothers also. The Reverend Mr. Thompson, as he was then called, bought my father, and he was married to my mother by him. Mr. Thompson ministered to the people of Canaan in holy things. His slaves worked his farm. For a short time things went on very well. But soon the North and the South, as now, fell out. The South must rule, and after a time the North would not be ruled. The minister's wife told my father if she only had him South, where she could have at her call a half-dozen men, she would have him stripped and flogged until he was cut in strings, and see if he would do as she bid him. She told him, "You mind, boy, I will have you there yet, and you will get your pay for all that you've done." My father was a man of considerable muscular strength, and was not easily frightened into obedience. I have heard my mother say she has often seen her mother tied up and whipped until the blood ran across the floor in the room where she was tied and whipped. Well, as I said, the South and the North could not agree. The South seceded and left the North. The minister's wife would not live North, and she and her husband picked up and went South, and left my father and mother in Canaan to work the farm, and they lived on the farm until I was 8 years old. My mother had one child when she came from the South. I was the first she had after she was married. They had 5 children born in Canaan. 3 died in infancy. I was born March 3rd, 1790. Mr. Thompson used to come up from Virginia and talk about our going South. He would pat me on the head and tell me what a fine boy I was. Once, when he was in Canaan, he asked me if I would not like to go with him and drive the carriage for my mistress. He said if I would go, he would give me 25 cents, or, as it was then called, 25 coppers. I told him I wanted the money first. He gave me a quarter, and then I would not agree to go, and he put me in the oven. That I did not like, and when I got out I would not give him the money, but his business I did not yet know. He had come to sell his farm, and to take us all South. My father said he would not go alive. The minister told him he must go. My father said he never would. Well, the man that had formerly ministered to the people in holy things sold the farm, and stock, and tools, and effects, with a few exceptions. He kept a pair of horses and harness, a wagon, a bed, and a few such articles. The harness and wagon he kept to take us to the South with. After he sold his place, he took us all to a wealthy friend of his until he had settled up all his affairs, so as to show to the world that he was an honest and upright man. He would have them think that he feared God and let alone evil, for he was born or raised in the state of New York, and had taught the people of New Canaan the way to do, as you will see, for in former days he spoke to the people from the pulpit morally, and they thought much of the man. He had taught them slavery was right, and that the great Almighty God had sanctioned the institution, and he would practice it. He now made his arrangements to set out on his journey. The day was fixed to leave his much-loved people and home for his Southern home, where he had obtained a new home and friends and acquaintances. My father, although a slave without education, was intensely watching the movements of the teacher of the people, but kept all that he saw to himself, yet he was steadily planning his escape. The set day had now within about 36 hours come. All went on well with the man from the South. He had had no thought but all was well. Those fine chattels were his, and would fetch him in a Southern market, at a moderate estimate, $2,000. They would furnish him pocket change for some time, and also his loving wife could have a chance to wreak her vengeance on my father for what she called disobedience. It was a matter of doubt with my father what course to take, how he could get away with his family, the best and safest, whether to go to Massachusetts, which joined Canaan on the north, or to Norfolk, which joined Canaan on the east. Very fortunately for us, there was at that time an unpleasant feeling existing between the two towns, or the inhabitants of Canaan and Norfolk. He said that the people of Canaan would side with their former pastor, and he found that the people of Norfolk would take sides against Canaan and their pastor. Then he thought the best that he could do would be to take his family to Norfolk, where they would be the safest. He concluded to take them to Norfolk, but how was he to get them there with what he wanted to take with them? He came to the conclusion that the horses he had for a long time driven might as well help him now in this hour of distress as not. He got a colored man to help him that was stout and healthy. They hitched up the parson's team, put on board what few things he had and his family in the still of a dark night, for it was very dark, and started for Norfolk, and on the way we run afoul of a man's woodpile, for it was so dark that he could not see the road. but we got off from the woodpile without harm, and arrived in Norfolk about 1 o'clock. I think we stopped at a tavern kept by Mr. G. Pettibone, and in him we found a friend. We unloaded what we had, and father and the man that was with him took the team back to Canaan, so that the parson might set out on his journey and not have to wait for his team, and father returned to where he had left his family. He felt that he had done all for the parson that he well could, for he had taken away his family off from his hands, so that the parson would be relieved from the care that must necessarily occur in such a long journey with a family on his hands to see to. And my father thought that the parson's old Jewel would be relieved from some of her pardoned habits, and from a promise she had so often made to him when she got him south. Well, how the parson felt when he had got himself out of bed and found that he was left to pursue his journey alone, the reader can tell as well as I, for he was a big and bristle man, but I will leave him for a while, and see what is to be done with us. It was soon known in the morning that we were in Norfolk. The first inquiry was, where will they be safe? The place was soon found. There was a man by the name of Phelps that had a house that was not occupied. It was out of the way and out of sight. After breakfast, we went to the house. It was well located. It needed some cleaning, and that my mother could do as well as the next woman. We all went to work and got it cleaned, and the next day went into it and stopped some time. Father did what work he could get out of the way, where he would not be seen, and it was necessary for him to keep out of sight, for Norfolk was the thoroughfare to Hartford. Days and weeks passed on, and we began to feel quite happy, hoping that the parson had gone south, as we heard nothing from him. At length we heard that he said he would have the 2 boys at all hazards. It was thought best that the boys should be away. So one dark night we heard that the parson was coming out with his men to find the boys, for have them he would. A man that lived near to us said he would take the boys where they would be safe. His name was Cady. It was agreed on, and he went with us over a mountain, over rocks and logs. It was very rough and steep, and the night was so dark that we could only see when it lightened. At last we got through the woods on the top of what is called Burr Mountain. We could look down on low grounds and see logs that were laid for the road across the meadow. At every flash they could be seen, but when it did not lighten we could not see anything. We kept on. Our pilot knew the way. At last we arrived at the place. The name of the family was Tibbles. The family consisted of an old man, a middle-aged man, and his wife and 4 children, and a very pleasant family it was. We had not been there long before it was thought best that my brother should be still more out of the way, as he was about 6 years older than I, which made him an object of greater search, and they were at a loss where to send him, as he was then about 14 years of age. There was a young man by the name of Butler, from Massachusetts. He was in Norfolk at the time studying law. He said he would take him home with him, and he did so, as I supposed, and I saw him no more for more than 2 years. I stopped with the family a few days, and then went home, or what I called home. It was where my parents and sister were. I found them very lonely. I had not been home many days before our quiet was disturbed, for the parson had his hunters out to find our whereabouts. He somehow found where we were. My sister and myself were at play out at the door. We saw 2 men in the woods, a little from the house, coming very fast, and they came into the house. My father was not far from the house. Mother was in the house. The men were Captain Phelps, the man who owned the house, and Mr. Butler, the law student. They told us that we must now say whether we would go with the parson or not, and we must decide quick, for the parson was coming, and he would soon be on the spot, and there was no time to lose. Mother had said she was not unwilling to go herself if it was not for father and the children, and the parson had made her such promises that she was somewhat inclined to go. The parson talked so fair to her, he beguiled her, I suppose, somewhat as our first mother was beguiled in the garden. The beguilers were both, I do not say preachers, but they were both deceivers, and he talked so smooth to mother that he beguiled her. He told her if she would go to Canaan and see to his things and pack them up for him, then if she did not want to go, she need not. Mother talked with father. He did not incline to go, but finally he consented. The parson ordered a wagon, and it was soon on the spot. But where was Joseph? He was not here. "I want him to go with us, that we may be all together," said the parson. Father saw what the parson's plan was. He told him the boy was on the way. He could get him when we got to Canaan. I should have said that those two men that came to tell us that the parson was coming hid in the barn before the parson arrived, and were not seen by him. They had a few words with my father while the parson went for his team. We set off for Canaan, and in the land of Canaan we arrived that day. "Where is Joseph?" Father said he would go for him the next day, in the morning or in the day. Father went, as the parson supposed, for Joseph. The parson was loading, mother was packing. All was now going on well. Night came, and when all was still, for father had told someone it would be late before he got back, he came and took the parson's horses, and took mother and the two children on horseback, and instead of going south, went to Norfolk, and got there about 2 o'clock in the morning. We stopped at a tavern kept by Captain Lawrence. The horses were sent back for the parson, for he said he should start the next day. But it seemed that he did not start for Old Virginia, for we often heard of him after that day. We stopped with Captain Lawrence a few days. It was thought best by our friends that we should not all be together, for it was found that the parson was still in the land and on the lookout for us. I was sent to a woman in the neighborhood by the name of Darby, a poor woman. I stopped with her a few days, with instructions to keep still. The old lady had but one room in her house. You may wonder why I was sent to such a place. Most likely it was thought she had so little room that she would not be suspected of harboring a fugitive. A man by the name of Walter lived nearby. He was in the habit of coming in to see how his boy did, as he called me. He told me when anyone came there I must get under the bed. I used to sit in the corner of the room so that I should not be seen from the window. I stayed there a number of days. I do not now remember how many. One day I ventured to take a peep through the keyhole. The door was locked. Someone came to the door. I made a bound and then a roll, and I was out of sight. The door was opened, and it was my friend, Mr. Walter. He was quite amused to hear the performance. He said he would take me with him the next day. He was going to work in a back lot where it would be out of sight. So the next day I went with him. It was quite a treat. At noon we ate our dinner in the field. That was new to me. After dinner Mr. Walter lay down on the ground. He told me he should go to sleep, and I must keep a lookout to see if anyone came in sight. If I saw anyone, I must wake him. I kept watch, but there was none came to disturb him in his repose. The day passed away, and we returned home at night, all well, as I supposed. But it seemed that the parson had his pickets out, and had got an idea that I was somewhere in the street. That night I had to leave my place at Mrs. Darby's, and went about a mile to a man's house by the name of Upson. He lived on a back street. I thought him to be a friend. I do not know but he was. But as I find that men now act in relation to slavery, I am inclined to think otherwise. The next morning the man went to his work. He was painting for the minister in Norfolk. Mrs. Upson sent me to the brook, a little way from the house, to fetch a pail of water. I did not like going into the street very much, but being taught by my parents to obey, I went without any words. As I got to the brook, a man rode into the brook with a cocked hat on. I did not much like his looks. I did not know who he was. Said he, "My boy, where is your father and mother?" I said, "I don't know, sir." "Where is your brother?" "I don't know, sir." "Where do you live?" "I don't know, sir." "Whom do you stay with?" "I don't know, sir." I did not then know the name of the man. He rode off, or rather I left him asking questions. He looked after me till I got to the house, and rode up. I asked Mrs. Upson who it was that came to the brook when I was there. She said it was Mr. Robbins, the minister. I thought nothing of it, for I thought all the people in Norfolk were our friends. In a few hours the woman sent me to the neighbor's to get some water from the well. It was a widow woman where I went to get the water, and there I found my father. He said that Captain Lawrence had been there, and told him that Mr. Robbins had sent his son to Canaan to tell Parson Thompson that he had seen one of his boys, and we must go in the woods, for he thought the parson would come out to look for me. Father took the water and went with it to the house that I brought the pail from. The family where I went for the water I shall always remember with the kindest feelings. We have ever from that day to the present been on the best terms, and I believe 3 of them are living now. 2 of them live in that same house that they then lived in, and the transactions of this narrative took place 65 years ago. Their name is Curtis. End of Part 1. Part 2 of Two American Slavery Documents by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Life of James Mars, a Slave Born and Sold in Connecticut, by James Mars. When Father came back, we set off for the woods pointed out by our friends. We went across the lots and came to a road, and crossed that into another open field. The woods were in the backside of the field. As we went on, we ascended a ridge of land, and we could see the road that led from Canaan to Norfolk. The road then went past the burying ground, and we could see it from where we were. We saw 14 men on horseback. They were men we knew. The parson was one of them. We hid behind a log that was near us until they got out of sight. We then went into the woods, and there we found my mother and sister. They had been sent there by the man that had told us of the parson's information of where I was. We all remained there. This, I should think, was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Very soon the thought of night came to mind, how we were to spend the night, and what we should do for something to eat. But between sundown and dark a man passed along by the edge of the woods, whistling as he went. After he had passed on, Father went up where the man went along, and came back with a pail or basket, and in it was our supper. We sat down and ate. The man we saw no more that night, but how were we to spend the night I could not tell. It was starlight, yet it was out in the woods, but Father and Mother were there, and that was a comfort to us children. But we soon fell asleep, and forgot all our troubles, and in the morning we awoke and were still in the woods. In due time the man that passed along the night before came again with more food for us, and then went his way. His name was Walter. We spent several days in the woods. How many I do not remember. I think it was the forepart of the week when we went into the woods. We were there over the Sabbath, for I well remember a man by the name of Bishop had a shop where he fulled and dressed cloth, not very far from where we were, and he came to the back door of his shop and stood and looked out a while, and went in and shut the door. I felt afraid he would see us. We kept very still, but I think he did not know that we were there. If he did, it did us no hurt. We were fed by kind friends all the time we were in the woods. One afternoon, or towards night, it was thought it would be safe to go to a barn and sleep. After it was dark, we went to a barn belonging to a Mr. Munger and slept, but left it while the stars were shining, and so for a few nights, and then it was thought we might sleep in the house. The next night, after dark, we went in the house of Mr. Munger for the night. My sister and myself were put up in a back chamber behind barrels and boxes, closely put together, out of sight for safe keeping. We had not been there long before Mother came and told us we must get up, for Captain Lawrence, our friend, had sent word that the parson said he would have the boys at any rate, whether he got the parents or not. His pickets were going to search every house within a mile of the meeting house that night, or search until he found them. But we went into the woods again. We were there a while again when it rained, and we went sometimes into a barn when we dared. After a time it was rather still, and we were at one house and sometimes at another. We had pickets out as well as the parson. It was thought best that I should not be with the rest of the family, for the hunt seemed to be for the boys. My brother, I have said, was out of the state. I was sent to one family and then to another, not in one place long at a time. The parson began to think the task harder than he had an idea. It rather grew worse and more perplexing. He did not know what to do. He was outwitted in all his attempts. Every effort or trial he had made had failed. He now thought of giving my father and mother and sister their freedom if they would let him have the boys to take with him. This they would not do. After some time was spent, the parson or his pickets had an idea that we were all at Captain Lawrence's house, shut up there. How to find out if we were there or not was the puzzle. They contrived various plans, but did not succeed. Finally, there was one thing yet. They knew that Mr. Lawrence loved money. They thought they would tempt him with that. So they came to his house and made trial. They met together one day and wanted to search his house. He would not consent for a time. They urged, and he refused. He finally told them on certain conditions they might go into every room but one. They went into all the rooms but one. They then wanted to go into the room that they had not been into. They offered him money to let them go into the room. How much he did not tell, as I know of. He finally consented. The much-desired room was a chamber over the kitchen. Mr. Lawrence opened the door at the foot of the stairs and called and said, "Jupiter," for that was my father's first name, "you must look out for yourself now, for I cannot hide you any longer." He then told the parson's pickets they must take care, for Jupiter says he will kill the first man that lays hands on him. They hesitated some. They then went upstairs still, and stopped a short time, and then with a rush against the door. It gave way, and they all went in. They found the landlady sitting there as composed as summer, with her knitting work, unconscious of an arrest to go south as a slave. But they found us not, although the room they last went into was the last one we had occupied all the time we were in that house, sometimes one night, sometimes a week, and then in the woods or elsewhere, as was thought best to keep out of the way. The pickets returned to the land of Canaan to see what was to be the next move. The parson then proposed to give my father and mother and sister their freedom if they would let him have the boys. That they would not do, but the boys he said he must have. As my brother was away, it was thought best that I should be away. I was sent to Mr. P.'s, well-nigh Canaan, and kept rather dark. I was there for a time, and I went to stay with a man by the name of Camp, and was with him a time, and then I went to stay with a man by the name of Akins, and stayed with him a few days, and went to a man by the name of Foote, and was with him a few days. I went to another man by the name of Akins, and was there some time. The parson was not gone south yet, for he could not well give up his prey. He then proposed to sell the boys until they were 25 to somebody here that my parents would select, for that was as long as the law of Connecticut could hold slaves, and he would give the other members of the family their freedom. It was finally thought best to do that, if the purchasers that were acceptable could be found. Some friends were on the lookout. Finally, a man by the name of Bingham was found. It was a man that my father was once a slave to. He would take my brother. Then a man by the name of Munger would buy me if they could agree. Mr. Bingham lived in Salisbury, Mr. Munger lived in Norfolk. The two men lived about 15 miles apart, both in Connecticut. The trade was made, and we two boys were sold for £100 a head, lawful money. Yes, sold by a man, a minister of the gospel in Connecticut, the land of steady habits. It would seem that the parson was a worshipper with the Athenians, as Paul said unto them when he stood on Mars Hill. He saw an inscription on one of their altars, and it would seem that the parson forgot or passed over the instruction of the apostle that God made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. The parson was a tall man, standing 6 feet in his boots, and had no legitimate children to be heirs to his ill-gotten gains. The bargain was made on the 12th of September, 1798. Then I was informed that I was sold to Mr. Munger, and must go and live with him. The man I did not know, but the thought of being sold, not knowing whether I was ever to see my parents, or brother, or sister again, was more than I could endure. The thought that I was sold, as I did not then know for how long, it was hard to think of. And where were my parents I knew not. It was a sad thought, but go I must. The next morning, I was to go the morning of the 13th, was a sad morning to me. The morning was clear, without a cloud. I was told where the man lived, and I must go, for he had bought me. I thought of my parents. Should I, oh, should I never see them again? As I was taught to obey my superiors, I set out. It was a little over a mile. The way was long. I went alone. Tears ran down my cheeks. I then felt for the first time that I was alone in the world, no home, no friends, and none to care for me. Tears ran, but it did no good. I must go. And on I went. And now 65 years have passed away since that time. Those feelings are fresh in my memory. But on my way to my new home, I saw my father. I will not attempt to describe my feelings when he told me he had taken rooms in the same neighborhood, and should be near me. That made the rough way smooth. I went on then, cheerful and happy. I arrived at the place. I found a man with a small family. It consisted of himself and wife and 3 daughters. The oldest was near my age. The family appeared pleasant. I ate a bowl of bread and milk, and was told to mount a horse that was at the door with a bag of rye on his back, and ride to the field. That was about a mile off. The man went with me, and on the way we passed the house of Mrs. Curtis, where I mentioned in the former part of this narrative of going for well water for Mrs. Upson. We went to the field and worked that day, went home at night. The family appeared very pleasant, and I felt pleased to think that the parson had gone, for I was told that he went the same day that I went to my new home. In a short time my father and mother and sister came into the neighborhood to live. I was allowed to go and see them one evening in 2 weeks. They lived about 60 rods from where I lived. Things went on well. I was very contented, and felt glad that the fear of being carried south was at an end. The parson was out of town and out of mind. I soon became acquainted with Mrs. Curtis's boys, for I passed the house where they lived every day, as Mr. Munger's farm was beyond where they lived. I soon was feeling contented and happy. There was one thing that was unfortunate for me. Mr. Munger was not a stout, strong man, and not very healthy, and had no other help but me, and of course I had many things to do beyond my strength. I do not complain of many things, yet there are 2 things more I will mention. One of them I feel to this day, and that I feel the most is that I did not have an opportunity to go to school as much as I should, for all the books I ever had in school were a spelling book, a primer, a testament, a reading book called Third Part, and after that a Columbian Orator. My schooling was broken and unsteady after the first and second winters, as Mr. Munger had no help, and had to go something like 2 miles for his wood. He would take me with him to the woods, and he would take a load and go home, and leave me to chop while he was gone. The wood was taken off from a fallow where he had sowed rye. It was in piles. Some had to be cut once, and some twice, and some 3 times. I went to school the most of the first winter. After that, my schooling was slim. The other thing was, he was fond of using the lash. I thought so then, and made up my mind if I ever was the strongest, I would pay back some of it. However, things went on, and I thought a good deal of Mr. Munger, yet I wonder sometimes why I was not more contented than I was, and then I wonder why I was as contented as I was. The summers that I was 13 and 14, I was sick. They began to think I had the consumption. They sometimes would say to me, "If you should die, we should lose 100 pounds." I do not know as Mr. Munger ever said that, but it was said to me. But I will pass on with my story. I soon found out that I was to live or stay with the man until I was 25. I found that white boys who were bound out were bound until they were 21. I thought that rather strange, for those boys told me they were to have $100 when their time was out. They would say to me sometimes, "You have to work 4 years longer than we do, and get nothing when you have done, and we get $100, a Bible, and 2 suits of clothes." This I thought of. Some of the family, or friends of the family, would tell me what a good boy I should be, because Mr. Munger saved me from slavery. They said I must call him master, but Mr. Munger never told me so I never did. If he had told me to, I should have done so, for I stood greatly in fear of him, and dreaded his displeasure, for I did not like the lash. I had made up my mind that I would not stay with him after I was 21, unless my brother did with the man he lived with. My brother had been home to see us, and we went once to see him. I asked my brother how long he was going to stay with Mr. Bingham. He said Mr. Bingham said he should have his time when he was 21. "Well, then, I should have my time," I said to myself. Things went on, and I found Mr. Munger to be a very good sort of a man. I had now got to be 15 years of age. I had got my health, and had grown to be a big boy, and was called pretty stout, as the word is, yet I was afraid of Mr. Munger. I actually stood in fear of him. I had now got to be in my 16th year, when a little affair happened, which, though trivial in itself, yet was of consequence to me. It was in the season of haying, and we were going to the hayfield after a load of hay. Mr. Munger and I were in the cart, he sitting on one side and I on the other. He took the fork in both of his hands, and said to me very pleasantly, "Don't you wish you were stout enough to pull this away from me?" I looked at him and said, "I guess I can," but I did not think so. He held it toward me with both his hands hold of the stale. I looked at him, and then at the fork, hardly daring to take hold of it, and wondering what he meant, for this was altogether new. He said, "Just now, see if you can do it." I took hold of it rather reluctantly, but I shut my hand tight. I did as Samson did in the temple. I bowed with all my might, and he came to me very suddenly. The first thought that was in my mind was, "My back is safe now." All went on well for 2 months or more. All was pleasant, when one day he, or Mr. Munger, I should have said, was going from home, and he told me, as was usual, what to do. I went to my work, and did it just as he told me. At night, when he came home, he asked me what I had been doing. I told him, but he did not seem satisfied. I told him I had done just what he told me. He said I had not done what I ought to have done, and I told him I had done what he told me. That was more than I had ever said before. He was angry, and got his horsewhip, and said he would learn me. He raised his hand, and stood ready to strike. I said, "You had better not." I then went out at the door. I felt grieved to see him in such a rage when I had done just as he told me, and I could not account for it. If he had been a drinking man, I should not have wondered, but he was not. He was a sober man. I could not get over my feeling for some time, but all was pleasant the next day. I said to his daughters that I would not stay there a day after I was 21, for I did not know what their father meant. I did just as he told me, and thought I was doing what he would be satisfied with. They told me not to mind it. Things went on from that time as well as I could wish. From that time until I was 21, I do not remember that he ever gave me an unpleasant word or look. While I lived with him, after that time, I felt that I had now got as good a place as any of the boys that were living out. I often went with his team to Hartford and to Hudson, which the other boys did not that lived in the neighborhood. I now felt that I could do anything for the family. I was contented and happy. The year that I was 18, Mr. Munger was concerned in an iron establishment manufacturing iron. He had a sister living in Oneida County, and he learned that iron was high or brought a good price there. He told me he thought he would send a load out there and get a load of wheat, and asked me if I would go out with the load. I told him I would if he wished me to. He said he did. He got everything ready, and I set out the 17th day of October, and thought it would take me about 2 weeks or thereabouts. On I went, and when I got there, I could exchange my iron for wheat readily, but none had their wheat out, and their barn floors were so full that they could not thrash. I had to wait a week. As soon as I got my load, I set out for home. I was gone a day or two over 3 weeks. After I got to Norfolk, I passed the house where my parents lived. They told me that it was very current with the people that I had sold the horses and wagon, and was seen by someone that knew me and was on my way to Canada. They said that Mr. Munger said he did not believe it. He said he should not trouble himself. Yet I went on home. He was glad to see me, asked if I had any bad luck. I told him how it was, and he was satisfied, and said when he saw the team that they were in better condition than they were when I left home. Now they may talk as much as they please. You and the team, wagon and load, are here. And when I told him what I had done, he said he was perfectly satisfied I had done well. He had no fault to find. Everything went on first rate. I did my best to please him, and it seemed to me that the family did the same. I now took the hardest end of the work. I was willing to do what I could. I was willing to work, and thought much of the family, and they thought something of me. Mr. Munger was receiving his share of offices of the town, and was from home a portion of his time. I felt ambitious to have our work even with others. He said his work went on as well as if he was here. End of Part 2. Part 3 of Two American Slavery Documents by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. Life of James Mars, a Slave Born and Sold in Connecticut, by James Mars. When I was in my 20th year, a nephew of Mr. Munger came to board with him. He was studying law. Mr. Munger and I were accustomed to talk about my term of service with him. I told him I did not mean to stay with him until I was 25. He said he thought I would, if I meant to do what was fair and just. I told him that my brother had his time when he was 21, and I wanted my time. He finally had some talk with his nephew, who said that he could hold me. But finally Mr. Munger made me an offer of what he would give me if I would stay. I thought the offer was tolerably fair. I had now become attached to the family. I told him that I would stay, as he had often said he thought I ought to stay after I was 21. I thought I would divide the time with him in part, as the offer he made would not cover the whole time. All was fixed, and I worked on. Nothing more was said for a long time about it. Then the thing was spoken about, and the same mind was in us both, and I felt satisfied. The fall previous to my being 21 came. All was right, as I thought. The winter came, and nothing was said. The last of February came. I heard it hinted that Mr. Munger had said that he should not make any bargain with me, but if I left him, he would follow me. The thing was understood by us, and I paid no attention to it. March came, and nothing was said. The 3rd of March was my birthday. All was quiet, and I kept on as before until the 1st of April. It was told me that Mr. Munger said that his nephew had examined the law and found that he could hold me, and what he gave me would be his unless he was bound by a written agreement. As there were no writings given, I began to think it was time to know how it was. There was another thing now came to mind. When I was 13 years old, Mr. Munger bought a calf of my father, and gave it to me, and said he would keep it until it was 2 years old, and then I might sell it and have what it brought. He kept it. He had a mate for it, and when the steers were 2 years old, he sold them for $24. He then told me that he would give me a heifer of the age the steer was, and when she had a calf, he would take her to double in 4 years. When I was 17, he gave me a heifer, and she had a calf that spring, and the 1st of April he said he would take her, and at the end of 4 years from that time he would give me 2 cows and 2 calves. That was agreed on. The next year, in March or April, one of his oxen hooked my cow. It hurt her so that the cow died. Well now, what was to be done? He said at the time agreed on I should have my cows. I was content with that and worked on, feeling that all would be made right. I thought I should have 2 cows with those calves when I was 21, and that would be a beginning. Afterward, I agreed to stay with him until I was 25. I could let them until that time. I will now go on with my story. I asked him for my cows and calves. He said he should not let me have any. He said if I stayed and did well, perhaps he would give me a cow. I asked him if that was all that I was to have if I stayed until I was 25. He said he would see. I asked when he would see. He said when the time came. I then told him I had been told that Warren, that was the name of his nephew, had told him not to give me what he had agreed to, and I wanted to know if he would do as he had agreed to or not. He said I belonged to him, and I could not help myself. I told him I would stay with him, as I had said, if he would give me a writing obligating himself to give me the sum we had agreed upon. After hesitating a short time, he said he would not give a writing. He would not be bound. I told him I had got that impression, and if you say you will not give me what you said you would, I will not work another day. He then said if I left him, he would put me in jail and keep me there a year at any rate. This was on Saturday. The next day I picked up what few duds I had, and at evening, as it was the Sabbath, I told him I had done all the work for him that I should do. I then bade him good night and left his house, and went to my father's. The next day in the afternoon, Mr. Munger and nephew came to my father's with a sheriff. I was not in the house. He told my father that he would pay my board in jail for 1 year, and I could not help myself. They took what few clothes I had and went away before I got home. It was well it was so. I told my father that I would stay in jail as long as Mr. Munger would find money. I sent the word to Mr. Munger. He sent me word that I should have an opportunity to. My people wanted to have me go away for a time. I thought at first I would. Then I saw that I had nothing to go with, and had no clothes for a change. I would not leave. I told them I would go to jail. I thought perhaps I could get the liberty of the yard, and then I could earn something to get some clothes, and then I would leave for Canada or some other parts. A few days after, I heard that Mr. Munger said he would leave it to men how it should be settled, and he sent me such word. I sent word to him, no, I was going to jail, if he would keep his word. He finally said, as I had always been faithful, he would not, or had rather not, put me in jail. My parents said so much, they did not want to have me go to jail, that I finally said I would leave it to 3 men if they were men that I liked. If they were not, I would not. He said I might name the men. Their judgment was to be final. The men were selected, the time and place specified. The day came, the parties met, and the men were on hand. Mr. Munger had his nephew for counsel. I pled my case myself. A number of the neighbors were present. Mr. Munger's counsel began by saying that his uncle had bought me and had paid for me until I was 25, and that he had a right to me. I then told his nephew that I would have a right to him some day, for he was the cause of all the difficulty. He said no more. The arbitrators asked Mr. Munger if he had anything against me. He said he had not. They asked him, in case they gave him anything, if he wished me to work it out with him. He said he did. They went out in a few moments and returned and said that I must pay Mr. Munger $90. He then asked me to go home with him and he would hire me. I told him I would go and get my clothes, for that was in the decision. He said I could have them. His nephew did not want me to live with his uncle if he boarded with him. I told Mr. Munger that I would not work for him. I hired to another man and went to work in the same neighborhood. This nephew kept an eye on me for a long time, and always gave me the road whenever he saw me coming. Mr. Munger and family always treated me with attention whenever I met them. They made me welcome to their house and to their table. If that nephew had not interfered, there would have been no trouble. Things all went on pleasantly. In about 4 years I went there again to work, and in a short time Mr. Munger and his 2 daughters joined the church of which his wife was a member. I joined the same church and was often at his house. Mr. Munger was unfortunate and lost his property, not as people lose their property now. He was poor and not very healthy, and his wife and daughter that was not married, not being healthy, and he being a man advanced in life, it wore upon him and his family, and his daughter went into a decline. I went west and was gone about 3 months, and on my return went to see the family and found the daughter very much out of health and wasting away. I called again the next day but one. As I had been accustomed to take care of the sick, she asked me to stop with her that night. I did so and went to my work in the morning. The second day after, I called again to see her, and she made the same request. I stayed and watched with her that night. She asked what I thought of her. I told her I feared she would never be any better. She then asked me to stay with her if she did not get any better while she lived. I told her I would. A cousin of hers, a young lady, was there, and we took the care of her for 4 weeks. I mention this because it was a time to be remembered and cherished by me while I live. We were in the daily habit of speaking of her prospects and how she felt. She would speak of death with as much apparent composure as of any other subject. She said very little to her friends about her feelings. The day that she died was the evening of the Sabbath. About 6 o'clock in the afternoon, or rather all that day, she did not appear to be as well, but at the same time just mentioned she sunk away and seemed to be gone for a short time, when she revived as one out of sleep suddenly, and seemed surprised, and said, "There is nothing that I want to stay here for. Let me go." She then bade her friends farewell, and told them not to weep for her, for she was going. Her countenance seemed as if lit up with heavenly love, and for a short time she seemed to be away from the world, and then was still, and said but little. About 11 o'clock she wanted to be moved. She was moved. She then wanted to drink. I gave her, or put the glass to her lips. She did not swallow any. I saw there was a change, and before her friends could get into the room, her spirit had fled. That was a scene that I love to think of. It makes me almost forget that I ever was a slave to her father. But so it was. I stayed until she was buried, and then I went west again. Her parents were broken-hearted indeed. I returned from the West and spent a part of the summer with Mr. Munger. I afterwards worked where I chose for a few years. I was frequently at Mr. Munger's house. He seemed depressed, his health rather declined, and he finally sank down and was sick. He sent for me, I went to him, and he said he wished to have me stay with him. I told him I would, and I stayed with him until he died, and closed the eyes of his daughter when she died, and his also. And now to look back on the whole transaction, it all seems like a dream. It is all past, never to be reacted. That family have all gone, with one exception. Appendix. This appendix is by request of those who have read what is before it. After the death of Mr. Munger, I married a wife and lived in Norfolk a few years. We had 2 children. We went to Hartford after a while. I worked for the then known firm of E&R Terry. There was a man came to Hartford from Savannah with his family. He came to school his daughter. He brought a slave girl with him to care for the smaller children. My wife washed for the family. All went on well for about 2 years. The Southern man's name was Bullock, and the slave's name was Nancy. One day when I was at work at the store, a gentleman came where I was. He asked me if this was Deacon Mars. I said, "Yes, sir." He said Mr. Bullock was about to send Nancy to Savannah, and we want to make a strike for her liberty, and we want some man to sign a petition for a writ of habeas corpus to bring Mr. Bullock before Judge Williams. They tell me that you are the man to sign the petition. I asked him who was to draw the writ. He said Mr. William W. Ellsworth. I went to Mr. Ellsworth's office with the man. I signed the petition. I then went to my work. I told Mr. Ellsworth that it would cause an excitement. If he wanted me at any time, I would be on hand. The writ was served on Mr. Bullock, and he was brought before Judge Williams, but Nancy could not be found. The court adjourned till 8 o'clock the next morning. At night, Nancy came to the house where they were boarding. She had been out, as she was accustomed to go, with the children. Mrs. Bullock told Nancy to go to bed. She somehow had an idea that all was not right. She opened the door and gave it a swing to shut, but it did not shut, as she said afterwards. She thought she would see what they were talking about. She said Mrs. B. told Mr. Bullock to start in the morning at 4 o'clock with Nancy for New York. Never mind the bond, and send Nancy south. I omitted to mention that the court put Mr. Bullock under a bond of $400 to appear the next morning at 8 o'clock. The plan to send Nancy south was fixed on. Nancy said to herself, "When you come where I be, I won't be there." She went out of the house and went to the house of a colored man and stopped for the night. The next morning the court sat. Master and slave were both there. The court said it was the first case of the kind ever tried in the state of Connecticut, and the Supreme Court of Errors was to meet in 10 days, and was composed of 5 judges. He would adjourn the trial until the session of that court. During those 10 days I had a fair opportunity to see how strong a hold slavery had on the feelings of the people in Hartford. I was frowned upon. I was blamed. I was told that I had done wrong. The house where I lived would be pulled down. I should be mobbed, and all kinds of scarecrows were talked about, and this by men of wealth and standing. I kept on about my work, not much alarmed. The 10 days passed away. The Supreme Court of Errors sat. Judge Williams was chief judge. The case was argued on both sides. When the plea was ended, then came the decision. 2 of the court would send Nancy back to slavery. 2 were for her release. We shall hear from Williams tomorrow at 8 o'clock. At the time appointed, all were in attendance to hear from Judge Williams. The judge said that slavery was tolerated in some of the states, but it was not now in this state. We all like to be free. This girl would like to be free. He said she should be free. The law of the state made her free, when brought here by her master. This made a change in the feelings of the people. I could pass along the streets in quiet. Nancy said when she went into the courthouse on the last day, she had 2 large pills of opium. Had she been sentenced to go back, she would have swallowed both of them before she left the courthouse. Now to my family. I have said that I had 2 children born in Norfolk and 6 in Hartford. 1 died in infancy. I lived in Hartford about 16 years. I took a very prominent part in the organization of the Talcott Street Church. I moved from Hartford to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. When I had been there 3 years and a half, my wife died in November. The May following, I lost a son 16 years of age. My oldest son enlisted in the U.S. Navy when he was 18 and has followed the sea ever since. I had another that went to sea that I have not heard from for 8 years. My oldest daughter went to Africa, to Cape Palmas. She went out a teacher and has been there 5 years. I have 1 son who, when the war broke out, when the first gun was fired on Sumter, wanted to enlist and did enlist in the Navy, and went out in the brig Bainbridge and served until she was stopped for repairs. He then went on the Newbern and served his time and was an honorable discharge. Another, and the last one, enlisted in the artillery and went to New Orleans, but never, no, never came back, nor will he ever come again. I have a daughter in Massachusetts of a frail constitution. She has a family to care for. I have none to care for me that has anything to spare, yet my children are willing to help as far as they are able. As they are not able, I feel willing to do all that I can to help to get my living. The question is sometimes asked me if I have not any means of support. The fact is, I have nothing but what I have saved within the last 3 years. I have spent a portion of that time with my book about the country. I am now in my 80th year of age. I cannot labor but little, and finding the public have a desire to know something of what slavery was in the state of Connecticut in its time, and how long since it was at an end, in what year it was done away, and believing that I have stated the facts, many are willing to purchase the book to satisfy themselves as to slavery in Connecticut. Some told me that they did not know that slavery was ever allowed in Connecticut, and some affirm that it never did exist in the state. What I have written of my own history seems to satisfy the minds of those that read it, that the so-called favored state, the land of good morals and steady habits, was ever a slave state, and that slaves were driven through the streets, tied or fastened together for market. This seems to surprise some that I meet, but it was true. I have it from reliable authority. Yes, this was done in Connecticut. August 22, 1866. I had a fall and uncapped my knee that laid me by 10 months, so that I was unable to travel or do anything to help myself, but by the help of Him that does all things well, I have got so as to be able to walk with a staff. During the time that I was confined with my knee, I met with kind treatment, although I was away from home. I was in the state of New York at the time of my misfortune, away from any of my relations. Still I was under the watchful care of a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. He has thus far provided for me, and I feel assured that he will if I trust him with all my heart and soul and strength, and serve him faithfully, which is my duty, the few years or days that are allotted to me, and it is my prayer that I may have grace to keep me, that I may not dishonor the cause of Christ, but that I may do that which will be acceptable in the sight of my Heavenly Father, so that I may do good to my fellow men. One thing in my history I have not mentioned, which I think of importance. Although born and raised in Connecticut, yes, and lived in Connecticut more than 3/4 of my life, it has been my privilege to vote at 5 presidential elections. Twice it was my privilege and pleasure to help elect the lamented and murdered Lincoln. I am often asked when slavery was abolished in Connecticut. My answer is, the legislature in 1788 passed an act that freed all that were born after 1792. Those born before that time, that were able to take care of themselves, must serve until they were 25. My time of slavery expired in 1815. Connecticut, I love thy name, but not thy restrictions. I think the time is not far distant when the colored man will have his rights in Connecticut. End of Part 3 of Life of James Mars, a slave born and sold in Connecticut by James Mars. Part 4 of Two American Slavery Documents. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4, Facts for the People of the Free States, by Anonymous. Chapter 1, Southern Scenes in 1846. Murder of Slaves. The Abbeville, South Carolina Banner states that 2 of Governor McDuffie's slaves were killed on Friday, February 13th, by 2 other slaves acting in the capacity of drivers. They were killed by what the law terms moderate correction. A slave woman attempting suicide at Baltimore. In June 1846, the Baltimore Sun gave an account of a woman who jumped out of the window of the place in which her owner had confined her, and immediately took the nearest route to throw herself into the water. She was rescued. But, says the Sun, upon being taken upon the deck of the vessel, she begged the bystanders to let her drown herself, stating that she would sooner be dead than go back again to be beaten as she had been. A slave suicide effected at Richmond, Virginia. A correspondent of the Philadelphia Inquirer, July 25, 1846, wrote from Richmond as follows: "An unpleasant occurrence took place in this city yesterday. A man, who has a number of negroes in his employment, was proceeding, for a slight offense, to punish one of them by whipping, when the poor wretch, knowing his master's unmerciful nature, implored that he might be hung at once, instead of whipped. This, of course, would not answer, and on tying the negro's hands behind him in the usual manner, the employer went into another room to procure a cowhide, when the negro, taking advantage of his master's absence, rushed from the room, jumped into the river, and was drowned." Slave suicide and slave hunting in Louisiana. In June, 1846, the New Orleans Commercial Times said, "We learn that a few days since a negro man, belonging to Captain Newport of East Baton Rouge, while closely pursued by the dogs of Mr. Rourke of this parish, ascended a tree and hung himself. Mr. Rourke, with Captain Newport's son-in-law and overseer, were in pursuit of a runaway slave. They did not know that this negro was out, and were surprised upon their arrival a few minutes in the rear of the dogs, to find him suspended by his neck, with his feet dangling only a foot or 2 from the earth. Every effort was made to restore animation, but without success, although on their coming up the body was still warm. The act was one, it would seem, of resolute predetermination, as the slave was well provided with cords, which he made use of to perpetrate his suicidal purpose." More murders of slaves. The Palmyra, Missouri Courier, in August, 1846, says, "We understand that a gentleman living in Macon County, while out hunting with his rifle last week, came suddenly upon 2 fugitive slaves, who gave him battle. He shot one, and split the other's skull with the barrel of his gun. He then started for home, but before reaching it, he met a man in the road, who inquired if he had seen or heard of 2 runaway negroes, describing them. The gentleman replied that he had just killed 2, and related the circumstance. On proceeding to the spot, the stranger identified them as his slaves." Chapter 2. The Fugitive Slave. A slave hunter killed. The following is from the Washington, Pennsylvania Patriot of 1846. We learn that a few days ago a fugitive slave from Maryland was pursued and overtaken in Somerset County, in this state, by a man named Holland, a wagoner from Ohio, who was tempted to the task by the reward offered, $150. When they reached McCarty's Tavern, the slave attempted to escape, but was caught by Holland while in the act of climbing a fence. The slave drew a long knife, which he had concealed about his person, and plunged it into Holland's heart, causing his death instantly. He made good his escape, immediately pursued by the people of the neighborhood, who at nightfall had surrounded him, but in the darkness of the night he eluded their vigilance, and is now beyond their reach. The Rights of the Fugitive. The Hon. J.R. Giddings, in a speech in the House of Representatives at Washington, February 18, 1846, said: "In regard to arresting slaves, we of the free States owe no duties to the master. On the contrary, all our sympathies, our feelings, and our moral duties, beyond what I have stated, are with the slave. We will neither arrest him for the master, nor will we assist the master in making such arrest. I am aware that the third clause of the second section of the first article of the Constitution was once believed, by some, to impose upon the people of these free States the duty of arresting fugitive slaves. But it is now judicially settled that no such obligation rests upon us. Indeed, a proposition to impose upon us such a duty at the time of framing the Constitution was rejected, without a division, by the Convention. We therefore leave the master to arrest the slave if he can, and we leave the slave to defend himself against the master if he can. We do not interfere between them. The slave possesses as perfect a right to defend his person and his liberty against the master as any citizen of our state. Our laws protect him against every other person, except the master or his agent, but they leave him to protect himself against them. If he, while defending himself, slays the master, our laws do not interfere to punish him in any way, further than they would any other person who should slay a man in actual self-defense. The laws of the slave state cannot reach him, nor is there any law, of God or man, that condemns him. On the contrary, our reason, our judgment, our humanity, approves the act, and we admire the courage and firmness with which he defends the inalienable rights with which the God of nature has endowed him. We regard him as a hero worthy of imitation, and we place his name in the same category with that of Madison Washington, who, on board the Creole, boldly maintained his God-given rights against those inhuman pirates who were carrying him and his fellow servants to a worse than savage slave market. Another slave suicide. The slave of a farmer in an adjoining county, Jefferson, having been jumped upon and stamped by his master with spurs on, so as to cruelly lacerate his face as well as his body, he was found next morning in an adjacent pond or stream of water, having tied a stone to his own neck, as it is said, and plunged in, for the successful purpose of drowning himself, under the feelings of desperation caused by the fiendish treatment of his master. Baltimore Saturday Visitor, August, 1846. Presidential Testimonies. George Washington. I never mean, unless some particular circumstance should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by which slavery in this country may be abolished by law. Letter to John F. Mercer. There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it (slavery), but there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by the legislative authority, and this, as far as my suffrage will go, will not be wanting. Letter to Robert Morris. John Adams. Great is truth, great is liberty, great is humanity, and they must and will prevail. Thomas Jefferson. The rightful power of all legislation is to declare and enforce only our natural rights and duties, and take none of them from us. No man has a natural right to commit aggressions on the equal rights of another, and this is all from which the law ought to restrain him. Every man is under a natural duty of contributing to the necessities of society, and this is all the law should enforce upon him. When the laws have declared and enforced all this, they have fulfilled their functions. The idea is quite unfounded that on entering into society we give up any natural right. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. And with what execration should the statesman be loaded, who, permitting one half the citizens thus to trample on the rights of the others, transforms those into despots, and these into enemies, destroys the morals of the one part, and the love of country of the other. For if a slave can have a country in this world, it must be any other in preference to that in which he is born to live and labor for another. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction on the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that his justice cannot sleep forever. When the measure of the slave's tears shall be full, when their tears shall have involved heaven itself in darkness, doubtless a God of justice will awaken to their distress, and by diffusing light and liberality among their oppressors, or at length by his exterminating thunder, manifest his attention to things of the world, and that they are not left to the guidance of blind fatality. Notes on Virginia. James Madison. It seemed now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interests lay, not between the large and small, but between the Northern and Southern States. The institution of slavery and its consequences formed the line of discrimination. Speech in the Convention for the Formation of the Federal Constitution. James Monroe. We have found that this evil, slavery, has preyed upon the very vitals of the Union, and has been prejudicial to all the States in which it has existed. Speech in the Virginia Convention. John Q. Adams. Nay, I may go further, and insist that the slave, representation has ever been, in fact, the ruling power of this government. The history of the Union has afforded a continual proof that this representation of property, which they enjoy, has secured to the slaveholding States the control of the national policy, and almost without exception the possession of the highest executive office of the Union. Speech in Congress, February 4, 1833. Fellow citizens, the numbers of free men constituting your nation are much greater than those of the slaveholding States, bond and free. You have at least 3/5 of the whole population of the Union. Your influence on the legislation and the administration of the government ought to be in proportion of 3 to 2. But how stands the fact? By means of the double representation, the minority command the whole, and a knot of slaveholders give the law and prescribe the policy of the country. Speech at North Bridgewater, November 6, 1844. James K. Polk. On the 12th of May, 1841, a resolution was introduced in Congress to the effect that the President of the United States be requested to renew and to prosecute from time to time such negotiations with the several maritime powers of Europe and America as he may deem expedient for the effectual abolition of the African slave trade, and its ultimate denunciation as piracy under the law of nations by the consent of the civilized world. The vote on this resolution was 118 ayes and 32 nays. James K. Polk voting in the negative. Congressional Debates, Volume 7, page 850. Mr. Polk, since occupying the presidency, has pardoned 2 individuals convicted in the courts of having been engaged in this trade. Chapter 3. Burdens of Slavery on the Free. The Presidency. Of the 14 presidential terms now expired since the formation of the government, 11 have been filled by slaveholders, 1 by a Northern man with Southern principles, and only 2 by Northern men. The present incumbent is a slaveholder, sworn fully to do his utmost to uphold and even extend the abomination. And most terribly, he is fulfilling his vow in the surrender of free territory in Oregon and in a war of conquest for slavery in Mexico, at a cost of millions of dollars and thousands of lives. By holding the presidency, slavery controls the cabinet, the diplomacy, the army, and the navy of the country. The power that controls the presidency controls the nation. No Northern president has been allowed to serve more than 1 term. The Vice Presidency. The President exercises much of his power by and with the Senate. The Vice President is ex officio President of the Senate. As such, he has the casting vote in all questions before that body. For the last 20 years, with one exception, he has been a slaveholder. From the adoption of the Constitution up to June 1842, there were 76 elections in the Senate of President pro tem. Of these, the slave states had 60 and the free states 16. Most of the 16 were in the earlier periods of the government. Mr. Southard was elected in 1842. Previous to that, no Northern man had received the appointment for 30 years. So careful were the slaveholders to watch their interest by securing the casting vote. Senate. For a long series of years, the Senate has been equally divided between the free and the slave states. In this condition of it, it was a great point with the slaveholders to secure the casting vote of the vice presidency, and right carefully have they done it. This vote is of less importance now, since by the admission of Texas, the balance of power is broken up, and the Valley of Rascals, on any tie vote, now rules the Senate and the nation. Department of State. The office of Secretary of State is the most important of any, perhaps, in the cabinet of the President. As it is the duty of this officer to direct the correspondence with foreign courts, instruct our foreign ministers, negotiate treaties, and so forth, his station is second only in importance to that of the presidency itself. Of the 15 who had filled this office up to 1845, the slave states have had 10, the free states 5. The whole number of officers in this department at Washington in 1846 is 86. Of these, Virginia has 6, and the District of Columbia 45. The War Department. In 1846, there are at Washington 98 officers in this department. Of these, the District of Columbia has 49, exactly 1/2, and Virginia and Maryland have the balance. The free states generally have furnished the seamen and the soldiers, the men to do the fighting and endure the hard knocks, but slavery has taken care to furnish Southern men for officers. Thus, of 1,054 naval officers, New England has only 172. Of the 68 commanders, New England has only 11. Of the 328 lieutenants, New England has only 59. Of the 562 midshipmen, New England has only 82. And New England owns nearly half the tonnage of the country. Of all the officers in the Navy in 1844, whether in service or waiting orders, Pennsylvania, with a free population more than double that of Virginia, had but 177, while Virginia had 224. In 1842, under Mr. Upshur, of 191 naval appointments, the slave states had 117, the free states only 73. Post Office. The greatest opposition to cheap postage is from the South. The reason is obvious. As multitudes of their post routes do not pay for themselves, they must be paid for through a system of high postage by the North, or be given up. Thus, in 1842, the deficit in the Post Office Department from the slave states was $571,000, while the excess over the expenditure in the free states was $600,000. This went, of course, to make up the deficiency of the South, so that in 1842 alone, the North paid all its own postage and $571,000 of postage for the South. Nor was this all. The whole number of miles of mail transportation for 1842 was 34,835,991, at an expense of $3,087,796. Of these miles, the mail was carried 20,331,461 at the cost of $1,508,413 in the free states, and 14,504,530 miles at a cost of $1,579,383 in the slave states. That is, it cost $70,970 more to carry the mail in the slave states than in the free, while it ran 5,826,931 miles less. Under the new system, from official returns, presenting a comparative view of the postage received at 42 offices, North and South, during the third quarter of 1844 and 1845, it appears that while the falling off at the offices in the free states has not been 1/3, that at the offices in the slave states has been more than 1/2. Civil, diplomatic, and consular agencies. That most of the spoils of office in these departments go to the slaveholders is well known. The following is the diplomatic agency of 1846. Full ministers: to Great Britain, Louis McLean; France, William R. King; Spain, Romulus M. Saunders; Turkey, Dabney S. Carr; Mexico, John Slidell; Brazil, Henry A. Wise, all from slave states; and Russia, R.I. Ingersoll, from Connecticut. Charges: Austria, William A. Stiles; Holland, Auguste Devizek; Belgium, Thomas A. Glenson; the two Sicilies, William H. Polk; Sardinia, Robert Wickliffe; Portugal, Abraham Rencher; Venezuela, Benjamin Shields; Buenos Aires, George Harris; Chile, William Crump, all from the slave states; and from the free states only Denmark, William W. Irwin; Sweden, by H. W. Ellsworth; Central American, B. W. Bidlack; and Peru, A. G. Jewett. Thus, of the 7 full ministers, 6 are from the slave states, and of the 13 charges, 9 are from the same; and the 4 given to Northern men are among the most insignificant governments in the world. And this favoritism of the South has been the policy for years. The civil and consular agencies are dispensed with a like injustice to the free states. The following, prepared by Professor Cleveland, gives the number of persons employed in 1845 in these several agencies, from a few states, with their salaries, and the number of free white inhabitants in the same. Presidential electors. During the 20 years ending in 1832, there were 6 presidential elections. Of these, the South cast 608 electoral votes, but only 41 of them for Northern candidates. During the 20 years ending in 1835, there were 5 presidential elections, in which the South cast 515 electoral votes, only 11 of which were for Northern candidates. In the presidential election of 1844, 13 free states had 161 electors, and gave 1,890,884 votes, 1 elector to 11,739 votes, while 12 slave states had 105 electors and gave 798,848 votes, 1 elector to 6,608 votes. In other terms, 6 slave state votes counted as much in choice of president and vice president as 11 free state votes. In the same election, Michigan had 5 electors and gave 56,222 votes, or 1 elector to 11,244 votes, while Louisiana had 6 electors and gave 26,865 votes, or 1 elector to 4,447 votes. That is, 4 slaveholding Louisiana votes were equal to 11 free Michigan votes. Federal representation. The present number of the House of Representatives, including Texas, is 228. Of these, 21 represent slave property. In fixing the ratio of representation after the last census, the House adopted that of 50,179. This would have given a House of 306 members and the free states a majority of 68. But a small majority is more easily managed than a large. The Senate rejected that ratio and sent back the bill with the ratio of 70,680. This reduced the House to 223 and brought down the majority of the free states to the more manageable number of 47. The effect of the odd number, 680, was to deprive the 4 great states of the North, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, of 1 member each, with no corresponding disadvantage to any slave state. Of this proceeding, even the correspondent of the New York Herald said, "The Senate apportionment has robbed the North of at least 1/4 of its practical influence in the Union, when regarded in its full extent, and the members of the free states who voted for it have thus surrendered the rights of their constituents and violated their trusts." The House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House has the appointment of all committees, and of course exerts an immense influence, in this as well as other ways, in the legislation of the country. During 31 of the 34 years from 1811 to 1845, the Speakers were all slaveholders. Judiciary. The Supreme Court of the United States is the court of highest appeal in the nation. Its decision on all questions coming before it is final. Of the 30 judges of this court, the slave states have had 17, the free states 13. The circuits and salaries are still more unequal and unjust. Vermont, Connecticut, and New York, with 42 representatives in Congress and a free population of over 3 millions, constitute but 1 circuit, while Alabama and Louisiana, with but 11 representatives and a free population of but 500,000, constitute another. So of other circuits. Louisiana, with a free population of 183,959, has 1 judge at a salary of $3,000. Ohio, with a population of 1,519,461, more than 8 times as great as that of Louisiana, has only 1 judge at a salary of $1,000. That is, with 8 times as many people to do business for, he receives 1/3 as much pay. Arkansas, with a free population of 77,639, has 1 judge at a salary of $2,000. New Hampshire, with a population of 284,573, has but 1 judge at a salary of $1,000. Mississippi, with a free population of 180,440, has 1 judge at a salary of $2,500. Indiana, with a population of 685,863, has but 1 judge at a salary of $1,000. That is 2/5 as much pay for doing more than 3 times the work. Surplus revenue. The surplus revenue distributed by the Act of 1836 amounted to $37,468,859. The slaveholders managed to have it distributed not as it should have been on the basis of free population, but that of federal representation. Thereby the South, with a free population of 3,823,289, received $16,058,082.85, while the North, with a free population of 7,008,451, received but $21,410,777.12, so that for each inhabitant of the free North there was received but $3.06, while for each free person in the South there was received $4.20, or $1.14 more for each free person in the South than for each free person in the North. The South, by this operation alone, received for her slave representation in Congress $4,358,549. Revolutionary War. In this war, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, 7 states, furnished 172,436 troops and were paid for services $61,971,167. Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, 6 states, furnished 59,335 troops and received $52,438,130. In other terms, the northern states furnished about 3 times the number of troops and received less than 1/5 more pay. In particular states, the inequality was far greater. The War of 1812. The slaveholders envied the commercial prosperity of the North, and to crush it, decreed the War of 1812 under the pretense of defending free trade and sailors' rights, and $137 millions were wasted in its prosecution, and $200 million more were lost on sea and land by Northern merchants and farmers, and then, leaving free trade and sailors' rights where they were before, they made peace and demanded a national bank and protective tariff. And in the prosecution of the war, says Alvin Stewart, Esquire, addressed to abolitionists, August 1846, the South placed Major General Smith at Buffalo, a slaveholding lawyer of Virginia; Major General Winder, a slaveholding lawyer of Maryland, at 40 Mile Creek on the side of Lake Ontario; Major General Wilkinson, a Louisiana slaveholder, at the Cedars and Rapids of the St. Lawrence; and Major General Wade Hampton, the great sugar boiler of Louisiana, and the largest slaveholder in the United States, having over 5,000 crushed human beings bowing to this monster and tyrant, was located at Burlington, Vermont. 4 slaveholding generals, with their 4 armies, were stretched out on our northern frontier, not to take Canada, but to prevent its being taken by the men of New England and New York in 1812, 13, and 14, lest we should make some 6 or 8 free states from Canada, if conquered. This was treason against Northern interests, blood, and honor. This horrid revelation could have been proved by General John Armstrong, then Secretary of War, after he and Mr. Madison quarreled. Florida War, removal of the Indians. While Florida was in possession of Spain, it furnished an asylum for slaves escaping from the contiguous states. It was therefore bought, at the dictation of the slaveholders, at an expense of $5 millions. For the same purpose and at the same dictation, the late Florida War was waged and the native Indian exiled. Of this, the Hon. J.R. Giddings, 1845, said, they, the Army, captured 460 negroes who were adjudged slaves by staff officers of the Army, to whom the duty was assigned, and who delivered them over to interminable bondage. See House Doc 52, 3rd Session, 27th Congress. We have no means by which we can determine the number of lives sacrificed in that war, but it may be safely asserted that the capture of each slave cost the lives of 2 white men, and at least $80,000 in cash, the most of which was drawn from the pockets of the people of the free states. The whole expense of the war is estimated at $40 million. The moral guilt incurred, and the sacrifice of national character, cannot be estimated. Perhaps I ought to add, on the authority of General Jessup, that bloodhounds were also purchased to act as auxiliaries to our army, and that bloodhounds and soldiers and officers marched together under the Star-Spangled Banner in pursuit of the panting fugitives who had fled from Southern oppression. House Doc 125, 3rd Session, 25th Congress. And bloodhounds and soldiers and officers were paid for from the avails of Northern industry, while our people were not permitted to petition their servants to be relieved from such degradation. One R. Fitzpatrick was employed to get the bloodhounds. He obtained 33, and the cost, including expenses of bringing to Florida, was $5,000. The removal of the Indians from the several slave states was merely to make room for slavery, and it has cost at least $50 million, and of all these millions, the North has had to pay the largest share. Texas and the Mexican War. Everybody knows that Texas was annexed and that the war is waged to extend and strengthen slavery. The cost of these measures is yet to be ascertained. There is little doubt that it will exceed, rather than fall short, of 100 millions. Bank, tariff, Southern bankruptcy, etc. The South originated the bank and the tariff. When they ceased to work for its interests, the South abolished both. The sums filched from the North by these changes of national polity and by Southern bankrupts seem almost incredible. $27 million of the capital of the United States Bank was sunk at the South. $500 million, it is estimated, would not more than meet the losses of the North in 60 years from Southern bankruptcy. In fine, there is no end to these burdens. This sidewise plunder of the free by those whose entire life is a wholesale plunder of the slave. How long will freemen bear it? We have a weapon firmer set and better than the bayonet, a weapon that comes down as still as snowflakes fall upon the sod, but executes a free man's will as lightning does the will of God. And from its force nor doors nor locks can shield you, 'tis the ballot box. Chapter 4. Slaveholding Religion. Maintaining Theological Seminaries. The following is the conclusion of an advertisement in the Savannah Republican of March 23, 1845. Also, at the same time and place, the following negro slaves, to wit, Charles, Peggy, Antoinette, Davy, September, Maria, Jenny, and Isaac, levied as the property of Henry T. Hall, to satisfy a mortgage fee issued out of the Supreme Court in favor of the Board of Directors of the Theological Seminary of the Synod of South Carolina and Georgia, versus said Henry T. Hall. Conditions: cash. C. O'Neill, Sheriff, M.C. Buying church furniture. A runaway slave in 1841 assigned the following as his reason for not communing with the church to which he belonged at the South. The church, said he, had silver furniture for the administration of the Lord's Supper, to procure which they sold my brother, and I could not bear the feelings it produced to go forward and receive the sacrament from the vessels which were the purchase of my brother's blood. Supporting churches by slave jobbing. The Reverend J. Cable of Indiana, May 20, 1846, in a letter to the Mercer Luminary says, I have lived 8 years in a slave state, Virginia. Received my theological education at the Union Theological Seminary near Hampton-Sydney College. Those who know anything about slavery know the worst kind is jobbing slavery, that is, the hiring out of slaves from year to year, while the master is not present to protect them. It is the interest of the one who hires them to get the worth of his money of them, and the loss is the master's if they die. What shocked me more than anything else was the church engaged in this jobbing of slaves. The college church which I attended, and which was attended by all the students of Hampton-Sydney College and Union Theological Seminary, held slaves enough to pay their pastor, Mr. Stanton, $1,000 a year, of which the church members did not pay a cent, so I understand it. The slaves, who had been left to the church by some pious mother in Israel, had increased so as to be a large and still increasing fund. Those who hired out on Christmas Day of each year, the day in which they celebrate the birth of our blessed Savior, to the highest bidder. These worked hard the whole year to pay the pastor his $1,000 a year, and it was left to the caprice of their employers whether they ever heard one sermon for which they toiled hard the whole year to procure. This was the church in which the professors of the seminary and the college often officiated. Since the abolitionists have made so much noise about the connection of the church with slavery, the Reverend Elisha Ballantyre informed me the church had sold this property and put the money in other stock. There were 4 churches near the college church that were in the same situation with this, and when I was in that country, that supported the pastor, a whole or in part, in the same way, viz., Cumberland Church, John Kirkpatrick, pastor; Briney Church, William Plummer, pastor; since Dr. P. of Richmond; Buffalo Church, Mr. Cochran, pastor; Pisgah Church, near the Peaks of Otter, J. Mitchell, pastor. Selling ministers as slaves. At the Great Convention at Cincinnati in June, 1845, Mr. Needham of Louisville, Kentucky, said, "Sir, in 1844, a Methodist preacher, with regular license and certificate, was placed in the Louisville jail as a slave on sale. He preached in the jail sermons which would have done credit to any white preacher of the town. He kept a little memorandum in his pocket, in which he marked the number of persons hopefully converted under his preaching. I represented his case to leading Methodists in Louisville, and showed them a copy of his papers which I had taken. Not one of them visited him in his prison. He said he forgave those who had imprisoned him, and were about to sell him. He was sold down the river, which was the last time I saw him." A slaveholding D.D. whipping his b'ch on Sabbath morning, preparatory to preaching. March 28, 1843. In a public address at Cincinnati, the Rev. Edward Smith, true Wesleyan of Pittsburgh, stated that he had lived in slave states 32 years, and speaking of a certain D.D. of his acquaintance, he adds, "He was a slaveholder, and a severe one, too, and often with his own hands he applied the cowhide to the naked backs of his slaves. On one occasion, a woman that served in the house committed, on Sabbath morning, an offense of too great magnitude to go unpunished until Monday morning. The doctor took his woman into the cellar, and, as is usual in such cases, stripped her from her waist up, and then applied the lash. The woman writhed and winced under each stroke, and cried, 'O Lord, O Lord, O Lord!' The doctor stopped, and his hands fell to his side as though struck with palsy, gazed on the woman with astonishment, and thus addressed her, the congregation must pardon me for repeating his words, 'Hush, you will you take the name of the Lord in vain on the Sabbath day?' When he had stopped the woman from the gross profanity of crying to God on the Sabbath day, he finished whipping her, and then went and essayed to preach that gospel to his congregation which proclaims liberty to the captive and the opening of the prison doors to them who are bound." The greatest impediment. "We are about to make an announcement," says the true American, "which must sound very strange to those whose field of observation is unlike our own. The greatest impediment to the success of the anti-slavery movement in the slave states is the opposition to it of those men who profess to have been commissioned by high heaven to go abroad and use their efforts for the mitigation of human misery and the extirpation of human wrong. This assertion, which appears so monstrous, will not surprise anyone who lives among slaveholders. Our conviction of its truth has been confirmed by extensive observation. Religious testimonies. Archbishop Potter. Some of our wise ones will have it that doulos means slave. Archbishop Potter, than whom no man was more learned in Grecian antiquities, in his work on them, published years ago, says, chapter 10, "Slaves, as long as they were under the government of a master, were called oketi, but after their freedom was granted them, they were douloi, not being, like the former, a part of their master's estate, but only obliged to some grateful acknowledgment and small services, such as were required of the metoikoi, to whom they were in some things inferior." The younger Edwards, pastor of a church in New Haven and afterwards president of Union College. Every man who cannot show that his negro hath by his voluntary conduct forfeited his liberty is obligated immediately to manumit him, and to hold such as one in a state of slavery is to be every day guilty of robbing him of his liberty or of man-stealing, and 50 years from this time (1791), it will be as shameful for a man to hold a negro slave as to be guilty of common robbery or theft. Dr. Adam Clark. Among Christians, slavery is an enormity and a crime for which perdition has scarcely an adequate state of punishment. Rev. Albert Barnes. From the whole train of reasoning which I have pursued, I trust it will not be considered as improper to regard it as a position clearly demonstrated that the fair influence of the Christian religion would everywhere abolish slavery. Let its principles be acted out. Let its maxims prevail and rule in the hearts of all men, and the system, in the language of the Princeton Repertory, would speedily come to an end. In what way this is to be brought about, and in what manner the influence of the Church may be made to bear upon it, are points on which there may be differences of opinion. But there is one method which is obvious, and which, if everywhere practiced, would certainly lead to this result. It is for the Christian Church to cease all connection with slavery. Rev. S. H. Cox, D.D. The cause of human rights is only the converse of the cause of human duties. And how pious, or how orthodox, or how heroic, I should like to know, is he for whose higher evangelical refinement of sensibility this subject of righteousness is too delicate to be theologized into our ethics, our creed, or our prayers. Away with such nauseating and hypocritical affectation in high places and low ones too. Letter to S. J. May, Auburn, May 5, 1835. End of Part 4. End of Facts for the People of the Free States by Anonymous. End of Two American Slavery Documents by Various.